Hi, it's Richard White again. Today's fly is what I think of as a little jig fry. It's a small fry pattern, about 1.5 inches long, tied on a jig hook. I started tying it because most of the flies I've seen tied on jig hooks, people want to put a big old heavy bead on the front, and if they put an eye on it, it's behind the bead, and that just never quite looked right to me. So I decided instead I'd weight the fly just a little bit differently, which would be using copper wire. So let me demonstrate how I tie this. So jig hook in, I've got some copper wire. This is 32 gauge. Here we go. 32 gauge magnet wire. So it's coated so it doesn't tend to corrode. It's very similar to what you would buy from a fly fishing shop as, wire for kind of a medium or fine gauge wire for ribbing flies, but it makes wonderful. It's wonderful for weighting flies because it's very easy to work with. So I'm just going to wrap onto the shank of the hook till I get all the way up to that front bend, and I'm going to compress those so I can get as many of these on as possible. And this is a size 8 hook, so I'm going to get like 30 turns before I fill that area. And then I'm going to go back over it in a second layer. It's going to add weight. It's also going to build up the body of the fly. And just so I don't have to deal with the end there, I'll start binding the waist part down also till I get back most of the way back, not quite all the way back, and then I can add another layer going forward. So basically I have 3 layers over most of the fly. Then I can helicopter off that piece. Then it's harder to helicopter the free end off here, so I will take a cheap old pair of scissors to clip off, and then I can press that down. Now I'm going to use a somewhat heavier white thread. This is Flymaster. I like the heavier white thread because it's going to be a mostly white fly, but also this slightly heavier thread so I can get better coverage because I'm not going to dub most of the body, so I can cover most of the copper fairly easily with the white thread. And since I'm not worrying about getting it perfect because other layers are going to cover most of that. So it can be a pretty approximate and quick to tie fly. Snip off the excess thread. Now, again, since this fly is going to be fished in this position, I have to think about materials going on sort of in the opposite order. So I'm going to tie them all on what we normally think of as the underside of the shank. So I'm going to use basically 2 colors of marabou. You can pick the marabou of your choice. You could use, fox fur, almost anything soft. I'm going to take a decent amount of black marabou here. Hold on to that, see how much of it I want. Now I don't want this to be a super long fly, so I'm going to go, the amount hanging off the back is going to be 1.5 times the length of the hook shank. I can lay that in. Make sure I keep it on top. Go over it a few times. I don't have to go all the way to the front. Come back over it. Clip off the excess. That's going to be the back of the fly. Then the layer under that will be white marabou. This is just going to make up the tail of the fly. And a similar size clump of white marabou. Straighten that up. lay that on top. Let me move this in just a little bit so we get the whole fly in. About the same length as the black. Lay it on top. Make sure I pinch it to keep it there. Come a little further forward so I get a little bit of a taper. Come back over it. Clip it off. Now, the rest of the fly is going to be built from a dubbing. This is from a company called Tigofly, and something I picked up on the internet. It's basically a sort of a moderate length UV white dubbing, pearl dubbing. And so let me take a small bunch of that out. And I'm going to lay that, I'm going to pluck it so I have about the length I want. And you don't want a dubbing it's too long here, because I don't want this going back beyond the tips of the marabou. And I'm going to move a little further forward. So I'm almost midpoint on the shank here. And I'm going to bind this on the bottom, but use my fingers to worry it around to either side a little bit. Bind it in the middle. I'm going to flip it over, make sure I get some on the far side. So I'm covering, roughly half the shank here. Bind that in. Sorry, let me get that a little better for you to see. Adjust the camera slightly. There we go. Then I'll take another bunch, similar size, treat it the same way, plucking it out a little bit so I don't have quite as long of fibers. This time I'm going to lay this on top of the shank, well, on what's going to become the top. Basically, I'm just trying to make sure I get complete coverage all the way around. And I'm going to wrap that down. I'll turn it to make sure I like what I'm seeing. In terms of coverage, right now it's going to look pretty messy. Then I'm going to fold these layers back on top and bottom. Fold them back and pull them back pretty tightly before binding them down fairly firmly. A number of turns to bind them down. Then I'm going to move forward right to that bend in the shank. And then I'm going to repeat what I just did. Now, if you wanted, or if you're on a longer shank hook, you could dub a little bit of the same dubbing in between to fill in the body, but this veiling is going to cover all of that, so it's really not important. So I'm going to take another little bunch, same as before. This time I'm going to pluck it out even a little bit more, which will tend to give me shorter fibers. And I'm going to lay that on the shank, and I'm going to try to worry it and wiggle it so it goes as much around the shank as I possibly can get it to go. Tying it in pretty much at its midpoint, but I'm trying to make sure my tie-in point is as close to the bend in the shank as possible. I'm going to turn it just so I can see that it's working on the far side nicely. All of that gets swept back. I'm going to do a few turns in front of it. Bind over it to hold it down. In front of it, as much as anything, putting turns in front to fill out the shape. So I get a nice taper. I'm going to come back up. Now to give it a nicer head, I'm just going to take, again, a little bit of the same dubbing. I don't need much here. Excuse me while I get it. And I'm going to take that dubbing, and this time actually dub it onto my tying thread. And this can be a little bit loose. It's just going to fill out the shape of the head of the fly. Oh, that's a little too loose. Tighten that up just a little bit. Come on, oops, too loose. So you don't like it, you go back and you redo it. And what I'm really trying to do here is to build the taper on the head of the fly. And then a few turns in front. And I can wiggle that back so you can start seeing the bait fish shape that it's going to have. Then, once I'm happy with that, I can whip finish. Come on. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And off. And that will be plenty. Snip the excess thread. Now, just to keep everything out of the way, wet my fingers so I can slick that back. You'll also get a better sense of the shape of that fly when it's wet. Now to put eyes on it, just going to use stick-on eyes, but to help the stick-on eyes stay on, I'm going to go and attach them with a clear mono thread. This one happens to be from Danville. So I'm going to start that it's sort of at the back of the head. Start the way I would start any thread. Clip off the excess. The mono thread I can lay down on top of the eyes, and that will hold the eyes in place while anything sets, because the stick-on eyes, they may stick on originally, but they don't stick on for long, unless you can do something to hold them in place. And the nice thing about the mono is it will disappear under your head cement. So now I have here these little, what do I have here? 1/8 inch stick-on eyes. They're really cheap. They give a nice eye effect, and I'm just going to lay the one on this side in what looks like a good position. Turn that towards you. Take another one to place on the other side. Look at it from the top to make sure they look reasonably well balanced. That eye has rolled all the way around. Take a little adjustment to get them where you want them. And once you do, you can use your mono to go over them just a few times. And the mono will hold them firmly in place and disappear. So I will rotate the whole fly so I can watch the mono engage with the eyes. And I'll go over the eyes several times, bring the monofilament, whoops, I'm losing my, we do it upside down here, in front here. Then I can, sorry about that problem when you rotate it, if you're zoomed in too far, it can jump a little out of your view. A few turns for a whip finish. Pop it off. Cut it off. Now here, this is one of the cases where you're actually going to want to use a fair amount of your head cement. I'm using Sally Hansen Hard as Nails. Use whatever it is you like. I'm going to apply it fairly liberally here, because I really want to coat the eyes and get it to soak in to the fibers around the head. I'm going to pull back on the fibers as I do it, and even go a little behind the eye so I get it into the fibers, and that will tend to hold them in place where I like them. And I'll add just a little bit more. As I said, I'm going to do a fairly liberal coating here. And that's the fly. It's very simple. I mean, sometimes you'll get some little snippets of fiber that hang where you don't want them. You can go back and clip them off. But when it's in the water, they'll all slick back. So let me put it into the fishing position. And that is how it would be looking and going through the water. So a nice little fry pattern. Fairly simple to tie. I hope you like it. If you like, subscribe. Add comments about things you think are good or not so good, whatever they would be. I appreciate any feedback I can get. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.